Are you thinking about buying or selling a home, or are a real estate professional and want to keep up with the Twin Cities' latest market trends, news, and stats? Then come hang out with us for a little while. Hi, I'm Kirk Duckwall, and welcome to the Twin Cities Real Estate Show. Joining me today is Danny Dietl, broker, owner of BRIX Real Estate. And we are going to deep dive into some pretty big kind of market changes in our area that I think it's really important for home buyers, sellers, and real estate professionals that may have not been working a lot recently, hearing about this stuff, to get a bigger understanding of. And so we're going to kind of skip out on the stats section of today's show so we can really spend our time focusing on these changes, because it is going to affect how real estate is done in Minnesota. Now, these aren't huge sweeping changes in comparison to other states that are experiencing. And part of that is because in Minnesota, we've had buyer's representation, I believe, since it was like 1989 when that became.
As long as I've been doing this, 20 years plus, so quite a bit longer than that.
Yeah, so, and there are states out there that, I think only 12 states have had buyer's representation when these changes were put out. And this is all due to a lawsuit that was done in Missouri, if I am tracking that correctly. And it ended up kind of making its way through the system and ended up being a settlement with NAR and a whole bunch of other large brokerages, and implemented changes across the board of how they want to see commission negotiation done between buyers and sellers and their agents.
Yeah. Do you want me to talk a little bit about what the actual case was? So people
Yes,
have a little
absolutely.
Context? So essentially, the case that was brought in Missouri was this idea that sellers were not having a say in the commission that was paid to the cooperating buyer brokerage. You know, historically, the way our system has worked is seller hires a listing broker, agrees to pay them a commission, and then that broker would take a portion of that commission and pay the cooperating buyer brokerage. Now, the contracts in other states had no distinction or breakdown. So a seller would show up at settlement and see that the commission that they agreed to pay the listing broker was split with the buyer broker. Our contracts in Minnesota have always drawn a distinction there and separated the two. So you saw very clearly what the listing agent was being paid and what the cooperating buyer brokerage was being paid. And you could have a conversation and negotiation, and this is what is so crazy about the settlement, is the idea that there's like some sort of standard or set fee. There's absolutely not. Every model in the world has existed, currently exists, will continue to exist for different levels of compensation and services. So again, the changes in our market are, while they're somewhat significant, they're more like process changes and offer a little bit more clarity. But the rules are really August 16th, August 18th, with the changes coming on the 17th, are fundamentally pretty similar.
Right. Yeah. Like you say, it's process. When something's done, when something's discussed. I think I want to kind of start off with what I feel is probably the biggest change that we're going to see and people are going to firsthand experience. Because I think when it comes down to listing contracts and when that's explained to a seller that's sold before, they'll be like, oh yeah, that's pretty similar, right? Not a major change there. But for anybody who's gone out and looked at homes, this could be something different than they experienced. Now, I do know there's a lot of agents that will sit down and have their buyer meetings and have the buyer representation contract signed, never show a home until they've done that meeting, everything's been signed. But if you go through any sort of real estate portal where you can book a showing, or you have your a referral or a friend calls you up, hey, can we go take a look at this house? They're just starting out their search. You just go book the showing and then you would probably have that buyer meeting, either after that showing at that point, get things going once they start talking about, price, terms, motivations, and things like along those lines. But now, do you want to explain a little bit about the change that we're going to see?
Yeah, well, and just for clarification, too, there is a Minnesota statute, so state law, that does require a buyer agreement be signed before any buyer services. Now, defining buyer services, there's not a perfect definition for that, but price, terms, motivation, right? But yes.
Right.
So theoretically, you could, walk through a house. The lawsuit kind of clarifies that. And again, the settlement is rule changes, not law changes.
Right.
So if you get an agent that walks up to you with a contract and says, you need to sign this 12-month agreement because it's the new law, be careful because they don't know what they're talking about.
Right.
It's not a law. You basically have to have an agreement signed that covers compensation and what the services are. Now, that can be a touring agreement that's very minimal, like a baseline level of services. So you're walking through a house, but if you want additional services, you can then enter into a more full-fledged buyer representation agreement. That can be non-exclusive. It can be exclusive. You can be a facilitator. All of these things come at different levels of service and potentially compensation.
Yeah,
but something needs to be signed before you can walk into a house with an agent.
Right, and that's probably the big
change.
That's the change, right?
Yeah.
So before you want to go see the house next door to you, you call up your real estate agent friend. They may be asking you now to sign something before you go into that home. You book that showing through a site like Zillow or whatnot. They're going to have those touring agreements. We have a couple minutes left of this segment, but let's chat real quick on a touring agreement. So that you said exclusive, non-exclusive, facilitator. What are those differentials?
So I think of a touring agreement as like a promise ring.
Right.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Like, hey, we're into this, but we're not engaged yet, right? We'll maybe get there, but maybe
you've been dating for a few months.
Yeah, and what I like about it is consumers should have a choice. Right. You should be able to walk through a house with an agent and see are they a cheerleader? Here's the dining room, or
look
is
at the Corinthian marble?
Yeah, or is it somebody who's going to actually kind of look for issues? Not somebody there who's there just to sell you a house, but to help you make good decisions. Really, more of an advisor. So
listening, not selling.
Yeah.
Right.
And so the touring agreement is more of an introduction into the relationship that can then progress or not. Maybe the agent doesn't feel like, you're a good fit. Either way, it's an opportunity for them to get to kind of know each other, or the non-exclusive route where you can work with multiple agents. That comes with its own issues, though, because agents are going to tend to prioritize the agents that they have an exclusive with because, if you're out working with 5 agents, how much time can they spend? Facilitation agreements, you're just there to kind of help, exactly what it says, facilitate. You're not offered any of the fiduciary responsibilities that you are with a non-exclusive or exclusive buyer representation agreement. But all the agreements need to cover how the agent is paid. And that's important.
So we're going to jump over, take a quick commercial break here. But I think ultimately the advice that I would want to give is just to take and go with that lease commitment, if you're just meeting an agent route and not dive into that contract until you get a good feel. All right, we're going to take that break. We'll be right back. Kirk Duckwall here again with the Twin Cities Real Estate Show. Our local sponsors are BRIX Real Estate, Network Title, Eric Bloomstrand and Chad Preby with Bell Bank Mortgage, and James Tufson with the Preserve Group. Welcome back to the Twin Cities Real Estate Show. Today we're kind of deep diving into some of these changes coming out August 17th in our real estate market. We just talked about, for buyers prior to going into a home for a showing, now it's going to be required to have a touring agreement or a representation, a facilitation, some sort of agreement in place. So that I think is a pretty big change with how things have been typically done with that initial meetup. But let's dive now into that representation agreement itself a little bit, because one of those changes, so you've done the touring agreement, you did the promise ring, now it's time to get engaged, right? You like that agent, and unlike in the past, I shouldn't say unlike in the past, because the option was there. We could call out, our commission would be X, and that could be paid directly. Just a lot of agents would end up, zeroing out and just reverting to whatever the payout was on the list side in most scenarios.
Well, yeah, and again, just for clarification, and this is what's so weird about this, is these changes are actually going to create a more opaque environment, whereas we brought clarity and transparency to the commission discussion like 4 years ago, where the buyer broker, so that the MLS, the multiple listing service, the originating database of all the listings that realtors use, is this guarantee of cooperation and compensation. So the buyer broker payout was listed in the MLS. Well, like 3 or 4 years ago, that got published on all the public sites. So everybody could see what it was, and you had a sense of like what the commissions out there were. That was a great addition. They are now taking that away. They are actually.
No, that was a Minnesota.
No, that was. So that may have been state by state. There were a lot of states that did it. It might have been national. I mean, either way, it was here, but I think it may have been a national change as well. But it gave everybody total clarity on what the commission was.
Well, clear cooperation, right? Yeah. That was that one.
Yes.
Yep.
And so a consumer would not feel like, because they could go to Zillow, they could go to any site and see that the commission being paid, and then you got a real clear idea: is my agent taking me to homes where it pays a higher commission? I think it's overstated, that level of behavior.
Right.
I've
never seen it.
Buyers choose the homes that they want to look at. What's an agent going to say? No, you can't see the home. Like, what's the reason? Unless you're going to actually have a discussion. Now, there is the argument that if you contract with an agent and you set your commission at whatever, and the payout was lower, a buyer may choose not to go see that house if they feel like they're going to be responsible for that difference. But either way, that was also always negotiable, and you could have negotiated that commission with the listing side prior to ever touring the home.
Right. So now they're taking away the publishing of the commissions on the payouts on the MLS sites, but they still can be advertised in other ways or
any other way. It just
broadcast.
can't be advertised on the MLS. You can do it anywhere else.
So the thing now, though, is because of it no longer being published, they're kind of going to this place where the buyer's agent and their buyer are going to negotiate up front what that buyer's agent commission will be.
Yep.
Right. Or will be or less. Right.
Yes.
Right. They can set a cap. Basically, are setting a cap.
Yeah. The only change in our buyer representation agreements is it says now the agent cannot receive any compensation over what they agreed to. Previously, sometimes people would do bonuses, things like that. I always would revert it back to the buyer anyways. Like, I agreed on an amount. I don't need to be paid more. And now it's just, you can get paid more, but you have to amend the agreement with your buyer. But yes, the buyer and the agent are going to establish what the compensation looks like. And then the way that's going to be paid is any combination of the following. The listing broker can still pay the compensation the way the old model was.
Yep.
The seller can pay it directly, and this is what I think is best practice and what is going to kind of be the market norm after this settling out period.
Yeah, it just creates one
6
less
months.
one
Yeah.
less
Well,
loop. Yeah.
this idea that listing agents were pre-negotiating buyer broker compensation prior to a transaction, the more you think about it, it was definitely a little goofy and unusual. There's nowhere else where that really kind of exists. So now the buyer and their agent negotiate, they determine what it is. You go make it part of the offer. That's it. That's simple. And the seller can counter on it. We are in a very difficult market for buyers in terms of home affordability. So if you're going to try and pass a hard cash out of pocket cost onto a buyer, and then there's this argument, who really is paying the commission? Is it the seller or the buyer? Well, it comes out of the seller proceeds, but there is no transaction without all the buyer's funds.
Right.
So, it's the buyer is absolutely participating in the compensation through the purchase anyways. You can work it into seller-paid closing costs. The buyer can pay directly, or any combination of those 4 options.
Yeah. Well, and
again, it's always been that.
Yeah.
No different. It's just that they're removing the guarantee of compensation from the MLS. So you're walking into a transaction without potentially knowing what the sell side is paying.
Right. And like we've discussed, it's nothing we've ever really looked at or like, okay, yeah, so now it's off of there. It's kind of just been what it is what it is. The differential now is we're going to set that number up front and figure out how it's going to be worked in through negotiation, which I actually think is great.
Yes. And here's the thing is, we talk about realtors as if it's like one big group and collective that like is organized. And you have the National Association of Realtors. You got 1.5 million people that could not agree on the color of the sky. So this idea that they all got together and like set some sort of commission structure, there were some averages, but no standard by any means.
I mean, I'm a data junkie. I'm working on this book right now, Improving Outcomes with Data. And I was going through looking at commission payouts, and it varies drastically from brokerage to brokerage with drastic result differences for sellers.
Yes.
Right. So I'm going to kind of segue with that a little bit. Let's talk about sellers, the listing now. I think, you hear what the big media is saying, politicians are saying, oh, we're going to save sellers. We're going to make transactions less expensive, removing fees out of there. Really, if you look at how it's structured on the listing side, there's still, you can choose, are you doing a buyer payout? Or is this something as a seller you're going to pay? How do you, which way are you going to, vehicle are you going to use for that compensation, if you want to use that vehicle for compensation? That choice has actually been there as well for a while, right? And so, the media, I think, when you look at how things are trending, and I was looking at this study, it was about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it was looking at age or buyers and sellers that decided to represent themselves, and it was something like 34% of them wish they would have used an agent after the transaction due to legal errors they made on their contracts. That's huge, right? And we keep seeing this trend towards more representation, not less.
Yeah, the process of buying and selling has not gotten less complicated. And all the information is out there. Everybody has access to data, websites, listings, comparables. How do you interpret it, though, is one thing. And so if you look at what the consumer behavior has been, I don't remember the exact amount. I want to say the percentage of people that used a realtor in the 80s was like 69% or something. We're at like 91% now. And actually the younger generations, the Gen Z and the millennials, are using agents at the highest rate. But even then, Gen X, baby boomers are still like in the high 80s. But I think the average right now is like 91, 92%. So consumers have said, we see value.
Yep.
And you've always been able to represent yourself.
Yep.
There haven't really been any barriers to that. Getting access to a house, or a listing agent's going to show an unrepresented buyer a house. Their job is to sell the house. It's always been an option. Will continue to be so. But to your point, the remaining percentage of people, a high percentage of them saw value. And it's one of those things, you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
So you might actually clear a transaction. You might not realize until 5 years down the road that you made a bad buy. You overpaid.
I mean, I just watched a listing, and I knew the person, and she had a friend helping, but she was basically watching, and she, her price just diminish, and I knew the representation level wasn't there. Right, we had talked about prior to it going on the market where the price was, and then talked about the things that needed to be done and the presentation. And again, going back to that book I'm working on, there is a very clear distinction in good representation and what a person nets versus poor representation or minimal and whatnot. I mean, I think we were just looking at one differential of between one company and another, and it was like $36,000 spread over 20 different properties. Each of them had done that. It's amazing that thinking taking this away or reducing this is actually going to benefit the buyers or the sellers. To actually have somebody there working with you, I think is and really looking out for your interests is really important.
Absolutely. But back to the buy side, though, I also want to clarify, not all realtors are the same. 1.5 million. And this is why I actually think the new model is good, is because the old model guaranteed compensation for the most incompetent agents.
Right.
Period.
Yeah.
That's a bad model.
Mm-hmm.
And now agents are going to have to have agents
Show
were
their
talking
value.
about their services being free. They're not. I'm sorry. Somebody wrote a check for $500,000 for a house and you got paid. Your services were not free. And so there was just the way that people were like finessing it to make it look like, oh, hey, sure, friend, just use me. You don't have to actually pay me. I just get paid over here, but it's free. And now there's going to be more clarity around it. And that's going to be really good for the consumer. And also, it'll stop rewarding the agents who provide below levels of service. There's a lot of really good agents out there, and there's a lot of really bad agents. That's why the turnover is like, what, 95%
5%?
fail in the first 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to have to demonstrate your track record, references, things like that. Those are all positives.
Yeah. No, I do think you're going to see people making decisions on the value that agent on the buy side is bringing, and hopefully on the sell side too. Both that both are going to have to show more clearly what it is that they are doing to help. I've said for years, talking when you're interviewing agents, get away from the puff. I sell 500 listings a year. Okay, that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
Again,
Some of the best agents sell a dozen homes a year. Some of the worst ones sell the most.
Well,
Actual number of sales is not it does not define an agent. It is the results in aggregate.
well, years ago, I said this line, and I use it in some of the classes that I teach, and I know it ticks off realtors. I'll say, my dog can sell a house. Well, what do you mean? I'm like, well, you can price a
it's
Ferrari.
a golden retriever.
Yeah,
of course.
Smart enough. No, you reduce, you sell a Ferrari for $500, right? Selling the house isn't the hard part. It's achieving the highest possible price with the least amount of stress, right?
Yep.
For a listing agent, and and then for the buy side, achieving the lowest price with the least amount of stress.
Well, not necessarily even the lowest price.
That you get it.
Right.
Right.
This idea, though, that like the finding of a house is not really the job.
No.
It is the managing of the transaction, the identifying of risk, the managing the risk, and helping make good decisions is where the value is.
Yep. Well, I think we did a really good job of covering the basics of what we are seeing. Any other thoughts on any of the contracts? I mean, touched on the showing agreements or touring agreements, buyer's representation, and the listing side of it. I think one thing, and maybe we spoke on this, but do you see like any advantage? I know we talked about seller paid versus buyer broker, but we didn't really talk about like putting nothing out there and just letting buyers and their agents bring forth what it is.
Yeah, I think that's going to be the best practice.
Okay.
I think it's, as a seller, you just say, we'll see. We'll see how the market kind of shakes out. Of course, if you just offer it out front, it's there for everybody. But I think just saying seller will entertain any and all offers of compensation. Just, hey, make us an offer, and we'll entertain the offer based on its merits, as well as maybe like digging a little deeper into the agent, see what their history is. Try and determine the likelihood of sellers care about money and they care about certainty. And this goes back to the issue of bad agents offer less certainty. And so you might see some of that. And I know a lot of agents are like, they're really unhappy with this idea that they're going to have to kind of work it into a contract. But why not? The old model just really, if you think about it, doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Well, if you have somebody caring about every last penny and trying to get it down or willing to accept the really low just to get a buyer, is that agent necessarily vetting the lenders correctly, right? How good and solid are their negotiating skills, contracts, whatever it may be, right? This goes both buy side and sell side, because at the end of the day, really, when an offer is made and you have two parties that want to come together, it's getting it to close, right? And if you don't have the vetted lender or inspection companies or whatever, making sure that the buyer's getting the good advice, and same with sellers, making sure that they're getting good representation.
Let's also not forget that the model that we are now transitioning out of, it was a good model compared to the model previously.
Yeah.
Every agent, that's what people don't understand. Every agent was a fiduciary, was an agent or sub-agent to the seller. They had a fiduciary responsibility to the seller, not the buyer. We decided buyers deserve their own representation, and that's how that compensation structure got worked out. And it served very well for decades, and now we're just kind of transitioning into what I hope is a little bit better model for everybody.
Well, I think this is the early stages of what's going. These changes have come out, and we'll probably see more as time goes on, and probably do another show in about a year.
There you go.
And see where they go. Well, thanks again, Danny, for coming in to talk about this. As always, if you have any questions, you want to discuss these changes more in depth, we have copies of the contracts highlighted with those changes. Happy to help explain any of that. You can reach out through TwinCitiesRealEstateShow.com. See you next week. Kirk Duckwall here again with the Twin Cities Real Estate Show. Our local sponsors are BRIX Real Estate, Network Title, Eric Bloomstrand and Chad Preby with Bell Bank Mortgage, and James Tufson with the Preserve Group. Don't forget to check us out online anytime at TwinCitiesRealEstateShow.com. There you can find all of our past shows, our weekly market updates, along with the latest and greatest searching and researching tools, and our free publications, to include the Smart Home Buyer Guide and the Smart Seller Guide, along with the BRIX Report. All of these free for you. If you have any real estate questions, please feel free to give us a call, 651-303-0019. Again, 651-303-0019. Happy to help answer any of your real estate questions or assist with your real estate needs.